two before the one. Wisdom is water, I'm the daughter of the cannon fodder. Applied knowledge and insight, a born scholar. Look like a martyr to marauders like Tartar. Wise owl slaughter, whack MCs order applauder. Original woman, decipher the womb. Crown of creation, fruit of the planet Earth.
Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, I have a very special guest. You've seen him on Wise the Dome plenty of times. One of my favorite scholars and people to interview. Good brother, Dr. Kamau Rashid. Thank you for coming through.
For sure. Thank you for having me. Very glad to be here.
Always, always. Today, the topic that we were talking about offline was science and oppression. And that was an essay originally written by Jacob Carruthers. You've also written on that as well. So before we begin with some of the specifics, why do you think, and you can speak from yourself too, because you wrote about this too, but why do you think this topic was important for Carruthers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So so there's a direct and indirect context for this essay.
Mm-hmm.
The direct context is what was happening at what is today the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, what then was simply the Center for Inner City Studies of Northeastern Illinois University, among the program faculty in the Inner City Studies program about the direction in which their curriculum should go.
Okay.
This essay was written in 1972, and so it is important to put this in the context of the fact that this is still in the Black Power movement, and so on the direct context is again the implications of knowledge construction for the movement and the need for this program to be one which is relevant, which will cultivate a critical consciousness in the minds of African people. But the indirect context, the broader context, was around the vectors of African consciousness, right? And the need to develop a framework around which we understand African consciousness vis-a-vis the broader liberation struggle. So directly, it was about the Inner City Studies program,
Mm-hmm.
but more broadly, it was about just African consciousness generally. And really, the essay is situated within a debate, this sort of back and forth debate among the program faculty, some in favor of Western science, others opposed to Western science. And so what he's attempting to do in this essay is to give some substance, some depth to the argument in opposition to Western science. And not only is presumed neutrality, but also is presumed universality.
Mm-hmm. So for those who haven't read the essay yet, the link will be in the description for the essay. And, as we move forward and within what we consider the conscious community, obviously there has been a growing, obviously you have the crazy pseudo stuff on one side, but there's also have been a push for scientific literacy as well. So when someone hears you say, hey, Jacob Carruthers was opposed to this Western idea of science, they may look at you like, why? And so if you can you just give them, an understanding or idea on, because a lot of people feel like, I think, that all other subjects may be subject to interpretation, but science is universal. And that's not always the case. But if you can talk about that some.
Yeah, no, that's a really, 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 really important idea. So again, Jacob H. Carruthers is a part of the Chicago School of African Centered Thought. And the Chicago School was focused comprehensively on the understanding of the condition of African people and the formulation of methods whereby we could free ourselves. But one of the conclusions that they came to very early on in the Chicago School, and this is evident by both this essay in 72, as well as the journal which they began in 73, the Afrocentric World Review. They had also taken the position that it was a key imperative for African thinkers to study the oppressor. Right? Of course, we should be studying our history and our traditions and also operationalizing those. However, that we have to understand the enemy. This essay comes out of the study of the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The Dr. Carruthers would be extremely critical of this idea of any knowledge. I would argue conceivably any knowledge system as being one which is neutral. I think I've written somewhere, and I don't know where I wrote it. It might be in the book, the book Jacob H. Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview, that all knowledge systems are reflective of the context or the circumstances of that conception,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is, and so therein, neutrality is not a reasonable premise. Now, we can talk about commonalities which exist across cultures, but knowledge systems themselves are by their very nature peculiar.
Mm-hmm.
Even if that peculiarity manifests itself in the idiom, that is the language around which those things are articulated, explained, or understood, right? And so that's one, right? He would argue, he would be ardently opposed to this idea of any knowledge system, including Western science, as one which is neutral and certainly one that's universal. But also he would point out, he would argue that if we want to make the argument that science is neutral, then we have to subject that argument to scrutiny. Well, what is the evidence? Well, history is the evidence, right? We can use history as one part of evidence, one body of evidence. We can use the other body of evidence could be the study of what the products of science, the role of science in terms of shaping the world in which we live, right? On one hand, he would argue, certainly, and he makes this point in the essay, Dr. Carruthers, and I have to dwell on this for a moment because this is
Mm-hmm.
something that is perhaps may not be clear to the reader or to the listener. In the essay, when he talks about science, he's dealing with what many people consider two distinct domains of knowledge, right? The social science and the physical science. He's arguing that those are, in fact, both modalities of science, which both inextricably emerge from the tradition of European thought,
Mm-hmm.
European Western philosophy, and which is again all based on the European worldview. And so that it is this worldview which gives form to a type of ideation, which then gives form to a particular orientation to the study of reality, which then gives form to the development of tools, processes, policies, and other applications, predicated upon that knowledge. And so for him, science entailed not just the creation of physical artifacts, as in the case of the smartphone or the automobile or the fighter plane or the Gatling gun, but also processes, tools of racialized containment, processes of policy development predicated upon the eradication of culture, curriculum which estrange people from their particular worldview and de-skill people over successive generations. He would consider all of these things reflective of a scientific process because they were all predicated upon a particular type of observation and experimentation over time. The other thing, and this is, and so what this indicates for him, he would argue that science that Western science has been from its inception exceedingly destructive. And this is all the more worrisome given that Western science has become the dominant mode of technological production in the world. Just again, terminology. Dr. Anderson Thompson, who was a counterpart of Dr. Carruthers, a colleague of his, but also another key thinker in the Chicago School of African Centered Thought, he would define technology as tool making and tool using. And this is important because, I listen to a lot of young people talk and it's like, yeah, because, we have all this technology now and blah, blah, blah. But if you hop in a time machine and went back, 50 years, they had technology. If you went back 4,000 years, they had technology. Technology is the tools around you. There's no point in us mystifying the tools of the present. People always have tools. But he would say that technology is essentially this process of tool production and tool application. The point is this. The question, though, that process of technological production is predicated upon the scientific process. And given that the Western paradigm has become the dominant paradigm of technological production in the world, it then necessarily begs the question of what has it wrought, right? What has been its fruit in the world? And when we look at a range of the things that are happening around us, we can just simply look at what's happening to the environment, both in terms of resource scarcity, but also in terms of climate change. It suggests that Western science is not only far from being neutral, not only certainly in its effects on the world, let alone its effects on humanity and other species, but that it is predicated on a particular worldview. That is, the advent of Western science as again the dominant mode of inquiry into nature and also inquiry into social relations and the corresponding development of technological systems based on that. This is not something which has a history longer than the last, arguably 4 centuries, right?
Absolutely.
In fact, the Industrial Revolution scarcely took place roughly less than 3 centuries ago, or
Right.
probably right around three centuries ago. And so, in the context of 3 centuries, you have runaway climate change, you have, in effect, ecocide, right?
Hmm.
Happening all over the world, destruction of ecosystems and the like, the creation of a state of affairs, which may very well result in the extinction of a number of species, which may very well include us before it's all said and
Right.
done, in 3 centuries.
Hmm.
Where you had civilizations in Africa and Asia and the Americas that existed for centuries and millennia. Again, it says something about the unsustainable toll that Western science has imposed upon the world and humanity. And so again, he would be very resistant to this idea of it being neutral on that basis alone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we can ever really point to a time where Western thought, European epistemologies have ever been neutral. Uh,
Exactly.
b- for those who may say, though, hey, but science is still science,
Hmm.
right? Do you think that they're missing the point here? You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
I feel like that, some
Yeah.
will say that due to how hard they push science as a tool of liberation.
Yeah. Yeah. And he talks about that in the essay, and he would say that and I think in the essay he refers to the idea that it is important for us to have, I guess what people today are calling scientific literacy,
Hmm.
so that we can understand the science of oppression, and so the science of oppression can be countered.
Hmm.
But I think he would also be resistant to the idea that this is necessarily the way upon which we should seek to exist and be in the world, that it is an insufficient basis for that.
Hmm.
Um, I think part of what complicates this again, because again, if we want to go down that, if we want to raise that as a question, if we want to treat it as a valid question, is science that is Western science? Is it neutral? Does it represent a neutral, a universal process of human inquiry into the nature of reality? Then that necessarily begs the question of how did people in this particular time and place engage in a process of inquiry into the nature of reality?
Right.
And I think if we honestly and forthrightly engage in the inquiry, we will see a number of important disjunctures between the methodology and the outcomes and the methodology, outcomes, and objectives of the Western scientific process in contrast to these others. And I think there are probably a few ways we could think about this. I'm thinking about like Sheikh Anta Diop,
Hmm.
who was himself a proponent of science, and
Yes.
he talked about. I know in that interview, Moore, the person's last name was Moore. I'm forgetting that first name, but in that interview, he mentioned the need for pluridisciplinary specialists.
Hmm.
This interview is in the book, the Ivan Van Sertima, the book that he published about Sheikh Anta Diop. I'm forgetting the title. I'm blanking the
I
title.
know exactly which one you're talking about. I forget the title as well.
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
heard that I've heard those books have been re-released as well.
They have, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I was,
yeah.
yeah, at our
Mm,
at our last conference, ASCAC, Association with Study of Classical African Civilizations
mhm.
Midwest Region Conference. A brother had them, so I picked up
See, I gotta, yeah,
like
I gotta,
in antiquity,
yeah,
and I've been hunting for those
yeah,
books, and
me
I
too.
really regret not buying them when I was young and they were
Hmm.
cheap. But you never think, hey, these books might be hard to find one day. I didn't think
Right,
that.
right.
But Sheikh Job in that essay talks about the need for pluridisciplinary specialists. And the what he was alluding to, what he was alluding to is something which is very germane to how knowledge production operated in traditional African societies, right?
Hmm.
So you see this when people talk about Ahmed Baba, and how he wrote manuscripts about everything from law to religion to various other types of inquiry. And so this idea of the pluridisciplinary specialist, I would argue, was actually the normalized mode of knowledge production in many traditional African societies.
Hmm.
And so I think that, but there's all so that's one part of this, right? That for our ancestors, knowledge production wasn't necessarily isolated in one single area,
Right.
or limited to one single endeavor. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So it was different than the type of the type of specialization, and perhaps they might even argue hyper specialization that's germane to knowledge production within the context of Western science. And I write about this in the book. One of the chapters deals
Yeah.
with, in fact,
Make
there are
sure
three
y'all
chapters that
make
are,
sure
yeah,
y'all go
exactly.
get
Thank
this.
you.
Make
Yep.
sure y'all go get this.
Thank you. Yeah, there are three chapters, all that are directly based on largely this essay, as well as another essay that that he wrote in 78 called on the discipline of inner city studies. And so the the idea of disciplinarity in terms of how Western knowledge is predicated upon that is not necessarily one which our ancestors necessarily had affinity with, and that relates to the next point, which is that in many of those traditional contexts, especially in for our ancestors, knowledge about the world was not simply empirical or not simply pertaining to the material, but also to the immaterial. That it simply did not only concern itself with the empirical, but also what people would refer to today as the spiritual. Right? This was also a component. There was a wonderful video on the Medicine Shell's channel.
Yeah.
If your listeners don't know the Medicine Shell and work with Derico Cotafor, they should definitely check it out.
Absolutely.
He deals with the Igbo paradigm, and he talked about how in the Igbo tradition, the idea was once a people find themselves in a particular place, that they have to acclimate themselves to that place, and that includes acclimating themselves to the physical dimensions of that place as well as the spirits that inhabit that place. And through this particular this interrelation, that they gain a deeper understanding of that ecology and how that ecology can serve their interests and the like. And again, whether you believe in this idea of a particular type of spiritual knowledge, the point is that our ancestors posited that knowledge was not limited to the empirical. Right. Knowledge entailed other dimensions, other ways of knowing. And again, we can, especially in the Western context, people, we can often be very dismissive of those things. But I find like when you interact with people, there are many aspects of their knowing that are beyond the empirical already that they give credence to. Right. So if you're around someone and you sort of have this strange vibe or whatever it is about, you may give credence to that, even in the absence of the empirical. And then later on, you find out, oh, that person was on this, and that, right? Or, those experiences that we have of intuition. We should or we should do this, or we should not, and then you later on find out that there was some validation in that. And so our ancestors, this idea that reality is limited to the corporeal was not necessarily a view that our ancestors had. And so part of the idea, part of their knowing, part of their epistemology, their way of knowing was predicated upon the idea of reality as expansive, including not just the material, but also the spiritual. And also I would say the type of the interrelations, the way in which, or the orientation towards interrelations. And so I'm referring to interrelations, not just, so when I'm thinking about relations, how I'm interrelating to you, how I relate to another person, but interrelations, how these things interact with each other. And in our traditional societies, people concede of a range of coterminous interrelations, whereby people are interacting with the members of their community and certainly the members of other communities. So you have one level of social relations which are occurring at the horizontal level. But also people are inhabiting or interrelating to the other species that live around them, right? The animals, the plants, the trees, and so forth. This is, again, another layer of this horizontal relation. But they're also ultimately living, interacting with the earth itself. But also in their worldview, their ancestors are a fundamental part of how they see themselves and how they see the world, right? And so for them, that idea of intuition is not just this feeling that's in their mind. They may see it as something which is also ancestral in essence. And so that's a part of the sort of a vertical axis in this, right? And also their conception of the divine, because for them, the earth wasn't inert matter. That tree is not inert matter. That river is not inert matter. These are things which reflect, which are divine themselves, right? Which reflect, this people use the term
they are
spirit.
Living. They're
Exactly.
seen as,
Exactly. And so that's that vertical plane. So people viewed interrelation as having both a horizontal axis as well as a vertical axis. And then maybe a third element of this, the third element of this would be related to this idea, therefore, of what did it mean to know? What did it mean to know? We can sort of enter into this on the level of something in which we can all relate to. We all have friends, we all have family members. What does it mean to know your mother? You know,
Right.
what does it mean to know your best friend?
Hmm.
You know, does it mean just to know, and so sort of these external superficial aspects of their lives, but does it mean to know as the, you know, the committee you would say their heart and their mind? You know
Hmm.
what I'm saying?
Hmm.
You know, and we often attribute this idea of knowing someone, you know, we truly believe we know someone, we feel like we know their heart.
Right.
You know, think
Right.
about like when somebody comes to you and say, oh, such and such did that, you're like, they would never do that. You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Because I know that person. I know what I
There's
know.
even slang where brothers are like, "That's my heart right there." Or
Exactly.
Sheikh Sufi, he told me one time, he was like, when someone asks you to point to yourself, why do we have the inclination to point to our heart?
Right.
Yeah, you know
Right.
what I'm saying? But go
Yeah.
ahead, my bad.
Yeah. No, no, I appreciate that. And so in our ancestors' worldview, to know
Hmm.
something or someone meant to know the essence of who they were.
Hmm.
Not just this corporeal thing, but to
Hmm.
know the essence of who they are. That's why Black people will say stuff, even now, even in the United States. You know, when someone, you know, makes a transition, we make a separation between the body that was here and them. You
Right.
know what I'm
Oh
saying?
yes,
People
absolutely. We
still walk
do.
around here talking to their departed ancestors and relatives and friends,
Hmm.
not, you know, not necessarily at a gravesite because they know there's a body in the ground, but that
Hmm.
person,
Hmm.
no, they're somewhere else, right?
Right.
Maybe here. You're
Hmm.
right, would be an example. And so for our ancestors, you know, their idea is that first to understand, to engage in inquiry about the universe, we have to engage in inquiry using multiple modalities of knowing,
Right.
right? Not just one. So we might study this thing using things which are germane to chemistry, or we might study this thing using the lens of history or geography. We might study this thing using a whole range of mechanisms in order to understand it. Two, we had to understand the things which are around us are also things uh, which have dimensions, complexity in dimensions, aspects or elements which may not be easily discerned when looked at on the superficial level. Therefore, in order to understand something, we have to understand it at its core. You know, and part of how we understand things at their core is by understanding how those things interrelate with other things which exist in the world around them. And so in our traditional context, part of that knowledge is bound up in today what people call the spiritual,
Yes.
right? Then this is why even today, when you look at these traditions of healing among Black people, whether it's hoodoo in the South
Hmm.
or or healing in the Igbo or the Yoruba, or any of these traditions, the healing systems are always bound up in the spiritual systems. There's a reason for that.
Hmm.
There's a reason for that.
Hmm. So I'm glad you said that, right? Because again, those that may see science as being the tool for liberation, and I'm not making this stuff up because you've seen these conversations,
Mhm,
and
mhm. Yeah.
um, but when we talk about, spirit things that aren't material,
Mhm.
regardless to whether one believes in those types of things or not, it still was a part, as you mentioned, it still was a part
Mhm.
and helped shape our worldview as African people. Do
Right.
you think the fact that when people hear these terms, spirit, or um, things that represent something outside of the material, that this is one of the effects of being divorced from how our ancestors see the world and the way they approached reality and science?
I definitely think so. Yeah, I definitely think so. Because the
Because somebody might hear it and they'll be like, "Oh, them brothers is talking some pseudo stuff right
yeah,
now." Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah,
And again, I'm not gonna, because again, I have to again, I have to be honest. I was born, in the Western society,
yeah.
have been socialized in this context as well. And so,
Me too.
right. And so my understanding of these ideas, some of these ideas at the intellectual level is different than than the sort of deep personal resonance they have with me, right?
Yes, same.
But I will say that oftentimes reality has challenged me on these ideas.
Mm.
You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? And like, and by that I mean like there are certain things that I can't like logically explain. Like when you have like I have these dreams ever since I was a child. I would always have dreams about the future.
Hmm.
And then but you don't remember the dream till it happens, and it's like, oh man, I dreamt about this. I
Right.
don't have any logical explanation for that.
Right.
right? Because if my mind is inside of my brain, which is inside of this object of corporeality, then how can it generate images of things that have not occurred within the context of my lived experience? That doesn't make sense unless the mind is something else which is delinked from this corporeality,
Right.
which is what our ancestors said, right?
Right.
Right?
Right. Right.
And so I think that we should entertain the idea of the finitude of Western knowledge.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
we should
Hmm.
not assume that European knowledge is infinite, and that our ancestors may have gotten some things right. Uh,
But even on a certain level like this, like we mentioned, like
yeah,
we can see in African cultures,
yeah,
especially pre-colonial,
yeah,
um, Native American cultures as well,
yeah,
seeing the earth and, as you mentioned, rivers, lakes, trees,
yeah,
plant
yeah,
life, seeing all these things as one,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
As living things, as
Right.
divine, that would keep you from destroying it.
It would, yeah, yeah. So and that's interesting. That's an Akan proverb, which I really love. It's "Tumi nya nya sase," which is all power emanates from earth.
Mm,
All power emanates from earth. And then, to me, that is such an extremely powerful proverb. There's
absolutely.
there's the medicine show brother talks about this, how in the Igbo paradigm, and there are people who've written about this. In the Igbo paradigm, earth, of course, and this is true of many African traditions, earth is a divinity.
Hmm.
Earth is divine.
Hmm.
And in the Igbo paradigm, so in the Igbo paradigm, earth is Allah is one term for, I think Ara is another. But the idea, you have some communities where the sacred oaths are taken on the earth.
Wow.
The sacred oaths are taken to the earth. You
Mm,
know what I'm
hmm.
saying? And the most heinous or the most serious moral violations are not just violations of the human community, but they are violations of the earth itself. Fukuyama writes about this, of how the earth served as a basis of sort of the ultimate standard of social ethics.
Mm,
Uh, and so part of the question, again, part of the question has to become, let's back up for a moment of this idea of spirit, since people, have issues with that. And perhaps I have issues with it also, right? But
right. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
in for a moment, what is being conceived here?
Hmm.
All power emanates from earth.
Mm,
What set of collective experiences over the course of successive generations shape this understanding of reality,
hmm.
right? Because we live in a society where the earth is conceived as inert matter.
Hmm.
You um, and I think one of the things, and you made this point, one of the things that they were able to see, one, is that the earth was foundational to their existence, to
Yes.
their collective well-being. But they were also intelligent enough to discern the interrelation between human existence and the earth. Why? Because the earth was the basis of all the social system, all the natural systems that they thrived upon. The
Hmm.
river from which they harvested water, the
Hmm.
river, sea from which they harvested fish, the land upon which they grew crops, right? The land from which they extracted metals and other types of minerals. The earth was the source of bounty which made human life viable and possible. So in a very literal sense, all power, all possibility, all is in Kemet, they would say life, power, and health,
Hmm.
aqua sine. But essentially all of it emanated from the earth. All of it was derived from the earth. But there's another dimension of this. Because as time went on, as they had more and more time to observe the world around them, they understood that Earth was not something it's not this thing upon which that we existed on top of,
Hmm.
but it was also something that we were dynamically engaged with,
Hmm.
right? Uh, Earth was also conceived, Earth was also the medium in which we would lay our ancestors to rest.
Right.
And so
Right.
Earth also became, in many respects, symbolic of our ancestry, which is why
Hmm.
many cultures, when they refer to their ancestors, they would refer to their ultimate ancestor as being the world itself, right?
Mm.
There was also this interrelation going back for millennia between themselves and the Earth, because the Earth is the place where the ancestors, where the bodies of the ancestors at least were laid to rest. And so I think that they were able to understand the way in which Earth was something with which we interacted. And it was the interrelation between people and Earth
Hmm.
as a life-giving system, and also as the vehicle, the medium in which they laid the ancestors to rest, in which those ancestors would would ultimately return to the earth, that they also saw themselves as bound up in this cycle. And so they were able to apprehend earth and life as something which existed beyond them. And it was in that type of continuity, that
Hmm.
thematic continuity, they were able to conceive of earth as being dynamic and powerful. And I think, like, when I think another way we could think about this, then, this idea of spirit, I was, in a way that may seem more reasonable for folks who may consider the term, irrational in terms of its typical uses, is I think they were able to conceive of Earth as a source of Tumi, as a source of power,
Hmm.
as a source of Ashe,
Hmm.
as this means this means of really ultimate instrumentality, whereby humans were able to exist and affect their will in the world. And if you want to think of that as spirit, this capacity, this energetic essence, I think that's also appropriate to this
Well,
to this.
I think it's also like, like how like someone may come in and you see, and you recognize the spirit of the person, right, in which
Yeah,
they come in.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and so I wanted to kind of just explain as well, the same way you did, that as someone who looks at things from an intellectual and scholarly level, I've often obviously struggled with having with certain concepts that exist outside the material. But
Mhm.
what I do is, again, I leave room. I don't shun it. I don't necessarily say, oh, that's pseudo, or oh, that's wrong. I
Mhm.
know how I grew up as someone, again, who was taught to see things, you know, like a show and prove type of community,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like, if
Mhm. Mhm.
you can't prove spirit, you can't prove some of these other
Right.
things.
Right.
But I still leave room, obviously, for maybe my own interpretations of these concepts, but also
Mhm. Mhm.
also how our ancestors and how our brothers in the church and sisters in the church may interpret it. Our brothers
Mhm.
and sisters in the mosque, or
Mhm.
brothers and
Yeah.
sisters
Yeah.
practice hoodoo, because at the end of the day, it all kind of has the same essence in what they're saying. Like, nobody does Christianity the way we do it. Nobody
Yeah.
does Islam the way we do it. And hoodoo is kind of a representation of that fact. So I don't
Mhm.
want people to get it twisted to think that, hey, it's just been, like that, like we're shutting down our intellectual faculties in order to believe in a thing, right?
Yeah.
But
Right.
no,
Right.
I think it's important to respect these ideas, though,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like you said, and how and there are things that resonate that you can't really explain at times, and I go through that as well. And one thing that, like, this idea of science and oppression. A couple years ago, Dr. Gilmore had put me on Sylvia Winter for the first time, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, when she talks about the idea of man one being this rational man during, the Western Enlightenment, biological man two, or man two, the biological man, after Darwin comes up with his theory of evolution. These well, even though that was scientific, right? It still helped shape and reproduce older hierarchies of race and
Mhm.
humanity.
Yeah.
Uh, you know,
Yeah.
after people began to start, seeing themselves as biological men, and outside,
Mhm.
and instead of, viewing themselves as just rational men, or how the church, viewing themselves in relationship to the church and God. But even then, we were
Mhm.
seen as the least evolved, or they would
Mhm.
even, like with like Shaking the Joke talks about, with Piltdown Man, they even wanted to, like, yeah, fight against the origin and knowing who the original people of the planet were. And so,
Right.
but you have, with saying that, to say this, I feel like that is an example of scientific thought still reproducing those same
Mhm.
colonial logics,
Exactly.
and showing that this indeed is not neutral. This indeed is not
Yeah.
universal.
Yeah. And this is interesting because the the idea, even that this idea of thinking or defining humanity, defining man on the basis of biology, biological terms, on the basis of race. For our ancestors, these would have been very reductive ways of conceiving of
Mm,
humanness,
hmm
very reductive ways of conceiving one's humanness. And this is like something you see in many African cultures. And Chukwunere Kamalu writes about this in Person, Divinity, and Nature, how within the African context, you have this idea not of a unitary self, but of multiple selves, right?
mm,
And this kind of also relates to that previous discussion. That is, and universally you would have seen the body would have been one aspect of the self, but there would have been others. So you would have the body, the heart would have been seen as another aspect of the self, not necessarily the heart which exists in our chest, but
hmm
the heart which is conceived of as the seat of one's will, intention, and
hmm
emotion,
hmm
right? You would have had the ancestral self, right? That part of you when people look at you and they say, "Oh, you remind me of granddad," or "You remind me of grandma,"
hmm
"You remind me of your aunt." That would they would call that the ancestral self, the part of you that came from your forebears. They would
hmm
talk about the in the Kemetic paradigm, they would talk about this sort of the energetic essence of the person, the ka, right?
hmm
The life force,
Yes.
and so you would have all of these dimensions of the self. Again, in the ancestral paradigm, like for our ancestors, the self wasn't the human wasn't reduced to biology. The biology was a constituent element in that, but also one's essence,
hmm
which also, for our purposes, also could be looked at as one's character,
hmm
right? And so there in that paradigm, in fact, there's a brother, I'm forgetting his name, but he writes about this in the Yoruba paradigm, that in the Yoruba concept, the idea of humanness, of being Iniyan, was also inextricably linked to how one existed in the world and in community, and
mm
therefore for them, humanness was fundamentally about how one existed in a holistic sense, one's character then, right?
Yes. To be
And
humane.
exactly, yeah, to be as a human. Swahili proverb, it says, I forgot the
Because
exact
we
Swahili.
talked about that before, once.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. To be human is to be humane. And
hmm
so for them, it's impossible to conceive of humanity inextricably as being delinked from that essence, from that spirit, from that character. And so
hmm
it is kind of quizzical that the very people who would impoverish humanity, that would plunge the masses of humanity into fundamental alienation as a condition, would then attempt to impose definitions or standards upon, what constitutes human. The fact that when they were in fact the least equipped to do so.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one thing I wanted to ask you too, in Science and Oppression, Carruthers drew parallels between conquest of African people and the conquest of uranium, right? Um, can you talk about that some for, again, those who haven't read the essay?
Yeah. This is he talks about, in fact, I want to just read a little bit of that section.
Absolutely.
It
Yeah, yeah,
might be,
yeah, for sure.
very valuable uh, for people, because he's drawing this parallel in terms of how these different, how both natural as well as social sciences work, and what they mean in terms of how they shape, how they have gone on to shape the world. I'm trying to find this section. Is actually one of my favorite quotes in here. I think it's on the last page. Nope. I'm taking a long time to find this.
Nah, you
Yeah. Oh, here it is.
good.
Here it is.
All
I
right.
got it. I got it. So this is on page 4 in the essay. Um, she says, thus, he says, thus, well, actually, no, I'm going to go back to a little earlier. He says, the science, no, I'm good. I got to go back. Every time I think I'm going to start on here. First, we must understand more precisely why scientific methodology has such a limited usefulness for oppressed people. The answer, in short, is that it is the master's science, not only in the sense that he uses it to control his subjects, but also in the sense that it was established through and for oppression. That is, the original assumptions are oppression, suppression, and repression. Thus, the science or methodology is not neutral or objective. It is the science of control through intervention and or the natural alteration, if possible, of all objects. When intervention and modification are successful, then the hypothesis is proved. If not, then impurification of the application and the methodology is alleged, either because of limited primary knowledge or bias. Thus, this is the important part. Thus, the conquest of Africa is not basically different from the conquest of uranium. Both started with a theory about harnessing certain forces and subduing for certain oppositions to the desired change. Both required laboratory experiments, cyclotrons for uranium and the West Indies slave system for Africans. Both resulted in the unnatural reordering of the behavior of the objects. And so he goes on from there. But the point is that, yeah, for him, these processes were linked, again, because he's arguing that the social science process and the process in the physical science, both emergent from European philosophical traditions, posited exploitation.
Yes.
Exploitation of nature as a key driver, as not only a key driver in human behavior, but as a key catalyst for the capacity of human growth and development, or societal growth and development. And so he talks in that essay he mentions the Principle of Machiavelli and also Francis Bacon's work. And in fact, when I was a student at the Carruthers Center, we would read Francis Bacon's work, Novum Organum, and what it posited about the relationship between humanity and nature. But this is the thing, right? and we see this, when we look around us, especially at some of these emerging technologies, AI being a good example.
Yes.
One of the things that's key in this passage is that he's talking about the exploitation of uranium and of African people as an instrument of power and control for the West, right? Your African people, the exploitation of African people for the sake of the acquisition of labor and ultimately resources to build these vast empires, which we're still grappling with today, or grappling with dismantling today. Uranium, of course, for the sake of harnessing is energetic capacity, which would lead to, the production of weapons. And so in both instances, we're talking about the exploitation of natural resources for the sake of processes of control, as well as the acquisition of power. And I would argue that even though he's using these two things as examples, these are things which we see operationalized recurringly within the context of within the context of the Western world view. Right. If we look at what's happening right now, say with artificial intelligence, for instance, artificial intelligence is, I think, one of the best cases. There's a Swahili proverb that says, mtoto wa nyoka ni nyoka. The child of a snake is a snake. And this raises some interesting questions in terms of what happens, what can a culture which is mired in fundamental alienation, what can it produce? Right. So let's entertain this idea that artificial intelligence constitutes a mind, right? Or let's entertain the idea that along the arc of its progression, it could conceivably come to embody a consciousness, perhaps not now, but perhaps in the future. What kind of consciousness, what kind of mind is created by a culture which is steeped in fundamental alienation? Right? There's a reason why when you look at the science fiction films and Europeans imagine the future, a future of technology run amok, a future where the works which they have wrought in the world have come to destroy them, that they imagine a world in which their technologies, or that they have essentially reproduced themselves in technological form, and that those technologies have done to them what they have done to humanity. This is also, should not be surprising. We found all these various thinkers, some many within the context of computer science, heralding the forthcoming doom of humanity, right, due to this technology. Because again, at a certain level, they perhaps know, right, what these things portend for our species as a whole. And again, if we consider that, again, going back to the analogy used in the essay, uranium, the exploitation of uranium and the exploitation of African people and African land and ultimately resources, and the goal of both of these things being the acquisition of power and control. What then does AI signify in this domain? And it signifies essentially that continued process, power over labor, power over resources, power over policy, power over information, and not in the interest, or not being, and not a tool which represents power for the masses, but
Hmm.
power for the elite. And so, these are
Yeah.
very, very troubling trends, but they, to me, are predictable outcomes, predictable outcomes of this particular society. And so he would be very wary of these technologies, but of this technology, but he would also consider unsurprising
Hmm.
that there's so much anxiety, so much anxiousness about it, right? And, if we look at AI, and this is like, again, we can step in from the future, right? And just, what is AI today? Like, what is AI today? Because we could say, well, all those scary and bad things, that it doesn't really fulfill this sort of pessimistic thesis in the present, but doesn't it?
Yeah.
If we look at, some of this research that's coming out now about what AI is doing to human cognition.
That's what I was going to ask you about too. Yep.
Yeah.
And can you let's stay there for a second.
Yeah.
'Cause I
Yeah.
don't think a lot of people understand that there have been studies that showing, in essence, Chat GPT, Grok, DeepSeek, people that are beginning to rely
Yeah.
on these types of things for one, it's not a source.
Right.
I
Right.
need you guys to understand that. But for people that are relying on it for its information, to it's showing that, hey, you're dumbing yourself down.
Yeah. 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 I mean, this is it's what is happening is that it's fundamentally changing our relationship to information.
Yes.
It's changing also. Um, I mean, and I think the research bears this out, that it's undermining people's capacity to engage in critical and deep reasoning.
Hmm.
And in effect, it's dumbing down, its user base to a significant degree. And it's kind of interesting when you think about this, because Karl Marx wrote about how industrialization de-skilled the working class. This is one of his core arguments.
Hmm.
Uh, and and I think, I'll be honest, I think that process of de-skilling has continued
Yes.
in various ways, in various sectors. And I think artificial intelligence is also contributing to a de-skilling of the populace, because thinking is a skill.
Hmm.
We know thinking is a skill because we have to interact with people who can't seem to do it very well, right? So, so apparently it's something you have to be taught, and apparently it's something you can be untaught, right? As well.
Right.
And so I think that part is very worrisome, that it is, and this again, he talks about in the essay, he talks about reordering, and he mentions reordering at least two or three times in that
Hmm.
essay, no, at least once in that passage, this idea of reordering natural systems,
Yes.
right? I mean, you have to think about this. If you think about the arc of the history of modern humans, Homo
Hmm.
sapiens, right? The longest part of our history, we existed as hunters and gatherers.
Right.
This idea of us being urban dwellers, this is really a very late phase of our history, really in the context of the last 6,000 years. But for most of our history, we were on the land,
Hmm.
negotiating our survival, determining what plants we could use to heal ourselves, and using those plants, preparing those plants, what foods we can eat, and consuming those foods, preparing those foods. We were engaged in a critical discovery as well as application of knowledge, as well as, because of the fact that we didn't have this, we didn't have print. We also relied upon these traditions of orality
Yes,
as
sir.
conduits of
Hmm.
information transition. So we had to all be collective masters of information,
Right.
right? Because something might happen to you, but there's vital information that you have that needs to be passed on to the community and the next generation,
Yep.
right? And so there were social links. There were social links which were both which were, again, existed in that horizontal plane between the self and the community, but also existed vertically between oneself and the ancestors. And those, of course, have been eroded over time. I think in many respects, artificial intelligence represent a continuation of that, right?
Yeah.
Because we've already moved from the space where, if I want to understand something, one of the best means for me to do that is to engage with others who have a deeper understanding of it, whether that is in textual form or whether that's in the context of verbal interaction, to the point where the AI tool becomes the new oracle. And then again, I'm not making the argument that search engines like Google weren't already in that place.
Hmm.
What the artificial intelligence tool represents beyond that is the idea, the appearance of knowledge,
Hmm.
the appearance of knowledge production. So
Hmm.
as an educator, one of the things that I have to be concerned about is people using the thing to write their papers,
Right. Right. Right.
right? And to write their discussion responses. We could consider this all types of knowledge production. And the reason why I would argue this matters, the reason why this is a type of deskilling is that rather than dealing with the difficult process of reasoning our way through the problems that we are faced with, we are instead giving those problems, we are outsourcing those problems to a technology.
Yes.
And in effect resulting in our long-term deskilling. And the reason this matters is because difficulties that we encounter in life tend to lead to greater adaptation in terms of our behavioral response over time,
Hmm.
right? So things that are hard now often become less difficult in the future, especially when we're talking about cognitive tasks,
Yes.
right? So we are bypassing that process. And so in terms of our development, our cognition as a species, artificial intelligence represents something which is deeply worrisome. And then we haven't even talked about the ecological
Oh
impact.
yeah, with the data centers and
Yeah.
how they are being put in black neighborhoods and
Yeah.
different
Seriously.
places in the global South. One
Yep.
thing that you kind of mentioned, also, it just made me think about, knowledge production 6,000 years ago, the
Hmm.
importance of it, survival,
Hmm.
um, also ideas about ideas pertaining to whether is like some animist idea of God or this like you mentioned this plant might be poisonous, this plant might not, but there's also one thing that I feel like we are losing and missing nowadays as well. And I got through reading Joseph Campbell's Power of Myth like a week or two ago, and he kind of talked about how these myths that our ancestors left us
Hmm.
during this time of industrialization and now in this AI revolution,
Hmm.
we seem to have no memory of these myths anymore and
Hmm.
don't see the relevance in them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I when I thought about it, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, 100%. This is
Hmm.
why I think it's important for us to continue to, as you mentioned, whether it's Igbo, Yoruba, ancient Kemet, we have
Hmm.
to keep our knowledge systems and the things that our ancestors passed down
Hmm.
with us. And I feel like AI is going to even is AI is going to continue to erase that from the memory of a
Yeah.
lot of our people.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think one of the dangers of, so one of the premises that's present in this essay in relation to the debate itself, and he doesn't talk about it explicitly, but he does talk about it explicitly in essays in ancient Egyptian studies and Black intellectuals and the crisis of Black education. He talks about the the imperative for the Black intellectual to ignore, to dismiss the African tradition.
Hmm.
That our ancestors knew nothing of value.
Hmm.
They didn't know anything, and if they did know anything, it wasn't anything of value, right?
Yes.
And I agree with you. I think that there's a world of meaning in the past, the stories we tell our ancestors told about the past. I was reading an article. I was actually thinking about this yesterday. I didn't, in preparation for a class, though it didn't come up in the class. How there was this article where they were talking about how traditional forms of therapy have proven ineffective among Maori communities in New Zealand. So the Maori and
Hmm.
the indigenous people of New Zealand, they're Polynesian people
Yes.
related to Hawaiians and Samoans and the like. And they were saying that these modern systems of therapy have not proven to be effective, have proven to be ineffective among them. And so you have this one group of therapists that started using Maori myths, and I'm putting myths in quotation marks, because Dr. Thompson would say that myths are neither true nor false, but he would, by paraphrasing, they're neither true nor false, but essentially the narratives that people make, which have shaped their collective psychology, as well as
Hmm.
told particular key stories about their past.
Yes.
And so I'm paraphrasing, but they started using these myths, and they found that these myths were very efficacious.
Hmm.
You have to think about the why of this. This is like really fascinating, right? Here
Absolutely.
you are telling people in the modern context these made up stories about things that never supposedly happened. Why would people find meaning in those stories, and to the extent to which these become sources of healing?
Right.
Well, part of why myths matter is because myths give us some idea, some inkling of how people in the past lived.
Hmm.
But probably most importantly to our situation, how people in the past confronted the challenges which were before them.
Hmm.
Right? I was teaching a African literature class a year or so ago, and I had the students read a range of texts, but one of the texts that I had them read was the Epic of Sunjata.
Hmm.
And for your listeners, if you haven't read the Epic of
You
you
have
should
to.
listen, Johnny. You have to read it.
Hmm.
You have, and you're going to see a lot of stuff in there that's very familiar to you. I mean,
Yep.
I'll leave that for you to discover. But one of the things that you find, it's a lot of there are myriad of lessons in that story.
Hmm.
There are myriad of lessons in the story. And one of the lessons in the story is that present events can have great implications for the future. And so you don't dismiss the present,
Right.
the seemingly mundane affairs of the present. That's one of the lessons. Another lesson you get from that book is the idea that even the people closest to you can be treacherous. As every proverb that says, a traitor sits under your chair. And you
Hmm.
see that in that story. There's some traitors sitting up under the chair. The third lesson is the idea of resilience. Sunjata couldn't walk. I mean,
Right.
this cat was like 7 years old, still crawling around on the floor like a baby,
Mm.
right? But at some point, when he realized that it was necessary to walk, found within himself the capacity to do so. And so you have this idea of the ability of the human being to overcome their limitations. Those stories were designed, they were intended not just to render the past, but to enable people to have a lens, a mirror through which they could see themselves,
Right.
right? And this is, Dr. Carruthers writes about this to a certain extent in it's an essay that we published in the Compass in 2018 about historiography. And I've written about it in my book,
Hmm.
and I flesh out some of those details as well. But the point is that those myths matter because those myths are intended to provide a means through which we see ourselves. And this is why those stories matter, and so, and this relates, and I want to say something and I want to connect this back to
Hmm.
this. These stories of the past are not just those stories from eons ago. As African people in the United States, we have a whole range of folk tales, whether you're talking about the Brer Rabbit stories. One of my martial arts teachers, Professor Mo, I think maybe on his YouTube, on the 52 Blocks Federation YouTube channel,
Hmm.
had a video about John Henry.
Wow. Hmm.
Again, that would be, an African American folk tale. Again, the veracity of the story is not what matters, and that's what Dr. Thompson's point was, is what the story tells us about the world and also about ourselves. But the other part is this, right? The myths also reflect people's attempt to make sense of the world around them.
Yes.
They reflect people's ability to formulate notions of truth from the world which is around them. And then that's also a part of what becomes the foundation of our culture, our collective way of seeing and being in the world. Um, so if you think about people, and you may have this in your, I didn't necessarily have this in mind, but you may have it in your family, and I'm sure some of your listeners do, or viewers. We're on video, just audio. Um, Folk remedies,
Oh yeah. My
folk
great
remedies.
grandmother. Absolutely. Hmm.
Exactly, exactly. Those, when you think about those remedies aren't just procedures, but those remedies are bound up in particular ways of seeing reality, ways
Yes.
of seeing the world, how we understand illness, how we respond to illness, even their conception of the arc of illness,
Hmm.
right? It's bound up in stories that they told themselves and told others about the nature of reality. And this is why I say, like, for our ancestors, and I'm looping this back to the essay, their idea of science, their idea of inquiry about the nature of reality and the application of their knowledge was multidimensional. It was multidimensional.
Yep. Absolutely. I think you can see that also in hoodoo, right?
Yeah.
Where
Mhm,
a
mhm,
lot of their, as you've read Mojo working with
mhm,
Katrina
mhm,
Hazard Donald. It wasn't just dealing with spirit, but there were things like midwifery that were
mhm.
uh, 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 you know, knowing which plants had which medicinal purposes,
Yeah.
but also it was like, as you mentioned, it was not just seeing things you know, in a, I guess, in a material manner, and it was just not just seeing things in spirit. It was the combination of the two. One thing I wanted to ask you too about the Maori people. Do you think, right? And it's so they were so I haven't read the article. So modern ways of the modern way of I guess getting psychiatric help was not helping them, right? And then they started incorporating some of their old quote unquote myths, right? It makes me feel like we have this like internal thing that lets us know that we cannot get swallowed up by modernity. We have to have
Yeah,
a balance
yeah,
with the and go back into the past
yeah.
some, because at the rate we're going, and like you mentioned before, it might not be a species,
Right, right.
and I don't think, and so also too, when we talking about science and oppression, and what is, do you think a lot of our people that may see science as a liberating tool are also missing how Western science is married to capitalism and capitalist production?
Yeah.
Meaning, like, there's this one guy, I forgot his name. I think it's Paul Rosalie. I watch his interviews sometimes. He's a guy that he actually lives out there in the Amazon rainforest. Um, and when he first started going out there and learning, he just eventually stayed.
Hmm.
But you know, again, he began to learn the ways of the rainforest.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, uh, he talks about, the different wildlife, the
Hmm.
plants, all of the things, right? So he's a part of that ecosystem.
Hmm.
But then he talks about, I remember one time he mentioned that he, I don't know. I mean, obviously in the rainforest, it's very easy for you to get sick, right? And so
Hmm.
he got something that
Hmm.
could have killed him, and the there were groups of people that lived in the rainforest for hundreds of years that knew that, hey, if you take this leaf over here, boil it and mix it with this, it'll go away in 2 days. Something
Hmm.
that could
Hmm.
kill you. And then he started to see, not necessarily for this illness, but for other things, he started to see all of these medicinal companies come into the rainforest, chopping down trees, like the
Hmm.
lumber companies, doing all these other things in order to manufacture a drug that indigenous people knew, how to make, right? And
Yeah.
so this idea of science and capitalism,
Yeah.
and how anything capitalism touches is going to be exploitative in nature. And
Yeah.
due to the fact we're talking about the nature of reality,
Right.
again, it can destroy the planet.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really at the heart of it, right? Whereas whereas the Dr. Carruthers would argue that whereas the epistemological foundations for the formation of modern science begin to manifest themselves within the context of uh, Greco-Roman antiquity, in terms of orientations towards knowledge production, that such a system that is such an orientation to the world reaches is sort of its apex of refinement among modern day Europeans, driven by the imperative of conquest,
Yeah.
enslavement and colonialism,
Hmm.
that is capitalism,
Hmm.
right? And so part of the part of the question, because when you said what you said earlier about, the people that argue that science can be a good thing, well, there's a fundamental issue here, and there's even European thinkers write about this. As a French social scientist, Jacques Ellul, who wrote a book, The Technological Society, and one of the things that Ellul argue, he says that one of the things that is a fundamental challenge is in relation to this fetishization of technology, and
Hmm.
this idea that technology bequeaths all these benefits to humanity, is that technology often exists as a tool of the powerful,
Yes.
preserve of the powerful.
Hmm.
And so
Especially look at
One of
militaries, right?
exactly, yeah. And so for the reality is that uh, capitalism that is an orientate a particular social system which is predicated on the acquisition of short-term profit, devoid of any ethical or consideration or ethical foundation, spiritual philosophy or practice, which is concerned about the well-being of humanity or the planet. Is in the context of that system, a system of knowledge production or inquiry about the nature of reality is necessarily oriented towards short-term interests,
Yeah.
not long-term interests. And I think we have to be honest about that. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't people who engage in scientific inquiry, which certainly has, has the capacity to bring enlightenment to
Oh,
humanity, right?
absolutely.
But within the context of those technologies which become instrumentalized, vis-a-vis the system of capitalism, yeah, I mean, those technologies are inextricably linked to a system of exploitation. And the analogy that you gave, I think, is a very powerful one. Here you have these life-giving systems that those folks living in that rainforest have probably maintained for millennia,
Hmm.
and all of that can be wiped out in years,
Right.
years, not decades, years, by industry. And so it does beg the question as to, again, the nature of that system and the capacity of such a system for reform. And that's one of the, I think, the tragedies of our thinking. You used to have Negroes, and not just us, but others who see some redemptive possibility in such a system because they see this process as being one which is universal, but it's very particularistic. Again, our ancestors engaged in inquiry
Well,
about the nature of reality. They didn't destroy the world of the process.
it and if you notice, sometimes they'll use look at all this technology we have as
Right.
proof that capitalism works, right?
Right. Right.
Um, one thing that a lot of one thing that I think we shouldn't lose sight of is also a lot of these technologies that we love and can't live without had military uses first.
Right. Yeah.
And within those military uses, black
Yeah.
and brown people were the targets of those.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
and so I think that is an important thing to also remember as well whenever we're looking
Mhm.
at how Western society uses science, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
um, and just because, maybe the public was not aware, um, trust me, um, a lot of these things are military sciences that we use. All right,
Mhm.
one last thing I wanted to ask you. Um, I think it kind of goes into this a lot, actually, where you were talking about mindfulness and
Mhm.
um, and no, it was a I thought it was a great thought because I think I've asked you one time about this, because I love Eastern thought just as much as, the next person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when we are fighting for our lives,
Mhm.
detachment doesn't seem to be, um, it, it doesn't seem to, like I get that doesn't seem to be the thing that we should be doing. Although
Yeah.
detachment is not mindfulness,
Yeah.
I think this relates to what I'm going to ask you. You were talking about mindfulness and its popularization and how it's pushed in the West. Uh, would you say that I guess the way it's pushed in the West is actually kind of used to make people complacent and non-reactive to these systems of oppression that we live in?
Yeah, so this was a post. I'm just saying this for the context for
Yeah.
the viewers. It was a post of an article, a psychology article, which was essentially posing questions to whether or not Western modern psychology. I don't even have to say Western psychology, just because if we say psychology, what else are we talking about, right? Psychology is focused not so much on changing the world, but enabling people to live in a world which is mad.
Mm, yeah,
It's a very
yeah.
interesting premise, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's an accurate premise
Hmm.
that that to a large extent, psychology is focused on reconciling people with an insane society. This is why Bobby E. Wright talks about this in his writing.
Hmm.
the diagnosis, the overdiagnosis of Black people as being schizophrenic.
Yeah.
Like, we crazy.
Right.
We, not the
Right.
world that we
Right.
live in, not the society.
Right.
We crazy.
Right.
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 And so one of the things that I argued is that I think that this also extends to these mindful practices. And I'll put this in this context, right? You have this popularization in recent years of all of these discourses pertaining to mindfulness, whether this in the context of mindfulness meditation or yoga practices and so forth, as these means whereby people can find inner peace, clarity of thought, and the like. And I think on the surface, all of that is great. And I think also that application is germane in many respects to how those traditions were conceived of in antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
However, we do necessarily have to pose the question as to why these practices and why now,
Right.
And I would say that if we look at sort of the social or institutional context in which we find these things touted, within the context of corporations, within the context of schools, within the context of institutions, which are not revolutionary institutions, which are not revolutionary institutions that we could even in our most fanciful notions, presume to be places where people are engaged in deep strategizing and execution around plans to liberate humanity, let alone African people. But these are institutions which are charged with the maintenance of the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And so what then are the implication of practices of this kind in institutions charged with the maintenance of the status quo? Well, it's to facilitate people's adjustment to the obvious discordance between where they are and how they are and what they believe, even if it's on a deep intuitive level, should be. And this is, going back to what you said earlier, like about the Maori piece, in terms of people having a concept or consciousness of the wrongness, right? of the sense to which how the state of affairs in which they're situated, how it is wrong, and leads to a rejection, if not even if not a conscious but an unconscious rejection of those systems and processes. And I think one of the things that unfortunately could happen, or I think that these tools can be used for, is to disarm people. Like, one of the things that is emphasized within the context of mindfulness is equanimity. And equanimity is very valuable. There are, if you have a spouse, and if you have a spouse, your spouse is going to do something. There's some things that you're not going to like. The rule of proverb that says, if you want to know patience, take a wife. Very wise proverb. I was cooking, I was making some food the other day, and I had this napkin that was sitting there that I was using to wipe my fingers on. And I looked up and I reached for it and it was gone. And I looked up, my wife, she came around grabbing it. Lady, I was using that, right? Well, that was a situation where equanimity was very important. Instead of me getting really mad, I wasn't mad about it, but let's say I had a really stressful day and there's just one more thing. And now I'm mad, right? That didn't happen. But let's say that had happened. This would be a moment for equanimity. This would be a moment for me to focus on being present in the moment, focusing on maybe I need to, breathe slowly just so I can center myself in the moment and gain some perspective on that situation. I think being equanimous can be very valuable in some of the situations that we face. But I also think that one cannot be equanimous in every situation. Right. If you are in a situation where your life is on the line or the lives of your loved ones on the line, that's not a situation in which one can be equanimous. If you are faced, such as the situation that we are faced with, which is oppression, Bobby Wright would say extermination, that is also not a situation in the face of which one can be equanimous. This is a situation which requires absence. And I will say, just for the sake of, being very forthright, if you read Buddhist philosophy, the Buddha himself, the historic Buddha himself, was not an advocate of passivity.
Yes.
Right. Like there's a tale about a murderer and how the Buddha goes and confronts the murderer. Right. And so he, so I don't necessarily think that he himself was even advocating this idea that, you live in the world, all these horrible things happen in the world, just turn away from that, sit in the cushion and meditate. I don't think that was the idea.
Right.
I do believe in this society that is the idea, that it's not that we should be engaged in developing our minds developing mastery over our minds for this, and in the process cultivating wisdom, which enables us to more effectively confront and change reality.
Mhm.
I think the idea is for us to rather adjust ourselves to this reality and learn to manage the difficult thoughts and emotions which this oppressive reality occasions. So I don't necessarily think it was that this is really within the intention of Buddhism itself. I think this is potentially an implication of what these mean in the modern context, because in the
Yeah.
modern context, I would argue that psychology as a system, as a school of thought, is not oriented around the transformation of the society and the fuller realization of our humanity, because the fuller realization of our humanity necessitates the eradication of this oppressive system in which we exist. Therefore, if its goal is not the fuller realization of humanity via those necessary actions, then it can only necessarily be our adjustment to that reality, which is intolerable.
Yep, yep. I agree 100%. That like you mentioned, like Bobby E. Wright said, we the ones that gotta, you know what I mean? Like
We
it's
crazy?
yeah, it's very I mean, I think that's a concept that I definitely want to explore a little bit more. Which Bobby E. Wright book was that? Is that the was that
The psychopathic racial
yeah,
personality.
yeah, I
Yeah.
have it somewhere.
Yeah,
I
it's
got it
not in the
somewhere.
first chapter, it's in one of the later chapters. If you remind me,
Okay.
I can put it up when I get home. But just to loop this back to Dr. Carruthers and Science and Oppression, the mind and the control of human consciousness is a process, is a science, is a part of that process, is a part or product of that science, he would
Mm,
argue,
hmm.
right? That's what makes it a science of oppression.
Right.
We have to develop, or the oppressor has to develop effective means whereby you control and direct the consciousness of the masses. This is also why it's interesting he has quotes by Dr. Carter G. Woodson at the beginning and the end of that essay,
Hmm.
right? The control of the mind, the control of the African mind and African consciousness is also a part of that process. And within a system of oppression, one cannot only rely on processes of coercion, but one also has to build within that process um, mechanisms whereby ideational impulses, which would lead to a rejection of that system, are also themselves reconciled and ultimately negated. You can negate some of that by co-opting people in that system, hence his work about Black leadership or the Black intellectuals. But you can also negate some of that energy by enabling people, by facilitating means whereby people uh, um, adjust themselves. You're right. By
Hmm.
rationalizing those feelings, by dismissing those feelings and those thoughts as being unimportant and inconsequential. And so again, you know, he would also argue that part of that science of oppression is the control of the mind. And so
Yeah.
it is interesting that mindfulness is a part of modern, systems of psychotherapy. And of course, it does beg the question as to why.
Hmm. Like you mentioned, and he quoted Carter G. Woodson, and he talked about how Western education often turns Black students into liabilities for their own people, right? And um, where does it leave us as a society, though, where more effort is spent on making us adjust to the sickness
Yeah,
of the society than
yeah.
actually fixing society itself?
Yeah, and that goes back to the AI thing as well, because I think
Oh,
again,
there's some up. I didn't mean to cut you off. There's some update and some like new news. Did you see what Elon said about what he he's such a he's such a interesting guy to say the least. But
to say the least.
this idea, first off, the idea that we're going to send somebody to Mars soon. I've heard most astrophysicists say that, yeah, that's not happening.
Yeah,
But secondly, he said that AI and humanoid robots that he's going to create are going to eliminate poverty and make everyone wealthy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. If you believe that, I got some swamp land on the south side of Chicago. I can tell you. Yeah, that's crazy talk.
Right.
That's crazy talk. And then and again, this these utopian statements about artificial intelligence suggest or what a belief in these utopian, declarations about artificial intelligence and its impact on society reflect a fundamental lack of understanding about the nature of this society, this reality. And I think that one of the it was something you said before the Elon Musk thing that I wanted to say. What was it?
My
What was
bad
it?
if I missed your train of thought up, man. I
No,
just
it's all right. It was a question you had asked. It'll come back.
let me see.
It was something about we were talking about the psychology, talking about the mind.
Oh yeah. So the idea that we must adjust to a sick society
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
instead of society being the
yeah,
sickness of society being addressed. You know what I mean?
yeah. And that was so yeah, that was it. So like the AI piece is to me again at the core of Dr. Carruthers' thinking. He doesn't talk about this in this article explicitly, but
Hmm.
it's there implicitly. Fundamental alienation.
Hmm.
Right. And so for Dr. Carruthers, fundamental alienation was this a core idea. Fundamental alienation is a key component of the European, and he would argue Eurasian ethos, which saw the world, which saw the universe as being characterized by conflict on every conceivable level of reality.
Yes.
Conflict between humanity and the divine, conflict between humans themselves, internal conflict, you know, the and this idea is bound is reflected in European historic mythology, but that it's also constantly reified in modern European social systems. There's a reason why we live in a political system that's predicated upon incessant conflict, that we
Hmm.
live in an economic system that engenders incessant conflict through its constant marginalization and suppression and exploitation of workers, right?
Hmm.
And so he would argue that fundamental alienation is the basic essence of the European worldview, but the problem is not simply that fundamental alienation exists in the European mind, but it shapes the physical realities that
Yes.
Europeans constructed, and
Hmm.
when we live in one such place as subjects of an internal colony. Well, the artificial intelligence, one of the very interesting things, and this kind of goes back to that research that people are doing in terms of its effect on people's minds. I would argue that it is facilitating that it is that is also further facilitating this condition of alienation because it's alienating people, it's estranging people from their own intellectual capacity.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
to live in a system on any level which constrains the fullest realization of one's humanity in all the dimensions, physical, mental, spiritual, ethical, and the like. Any system which constrains the full realization, the full expression of that humanity is by its very nature an oppressive system. It is by its very nature a system which creates conditions of alienation rather than conditions of enlightenment and human flourishing. And therein lies the imperative to undo such a system and to replace it with one that is inherently more humane. And there's a piece
But
that he said. Go ahead, sir.
no, I'm just going to say, but like, isn't there like a spiritual aspect to work, right? Meaning
Yeah,
like, like African blacksmiths and
yeah,
these
yeah,
things, right?
yeah,
Nobody said we want to get rid of. We said we didn't. We're trying
yeah.
to. We don't want our labor exploited,
Oh
right?
man, right, right,
We
right.
didn't
Yep,
say we didn't. There's no need for work. You
right.
know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
But this
That's
idea that we want to have, it has some slave logic to it as well.
yeah.
We're going to let these robots do from the way he's talking, let these humanoid robots do the
Hmm.
work for us.
Hmm.
We're going to
Yeah,
get wealthy. Like it's kind of weird, but
yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, he takes up this issue in one or two essays in intellectual warfare, and he argues I'm glad you mentioned that. He makes the point that there historically has been this antipathy for work
Hmm.
in the European world,
Hmm.
going all the way back to the Greeks, where work was conceived of as drudgery, you
Mm.
know, toil, oppressive,
Hmm.
and so there's been this incessant hatred, loathing of work, and this idea, has been sustained and transmitted over time, and of course, perhaps the highest manifestation that we know of via our experience is where that work, was born on the backs of our enslaved ancestors in the
Hmm.
Americas. Because in the European imagination, work is something which is for subordinates.
Right.
Work is for the exploited. work is something which is dehumanizing, therefore it's for the inhuman, the subhuman. And so it is quite apropos that the workers of the future, at least in Musk's imagination, will be automatons, right? Robots, machines. Well, this raises an interesting question. How did our ancestors conceive of work?
Right.
Right. And this is, again, this is the danger of, and this is true of so many of our people, unfortunately, this is the danger of our cultural imagination being limited to the European paradigm, right? You know, and you could see, I'll deal with this in the present sense, and I will move to a historic example. One element of this, one way you could think about this in terms of how it manifests itself in the present is, and this is some way so that we can sort of relate to it, how we feel about the things that we do for our families and communities.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And I'm thinking like when my children, especially when they were younger, and they came to me and said, "Hey, could you help me put this thing together?" You know, this is not work in the sense of that being toil and drudgery. You know, this is that type of interrelation which I referred to earlier, right? This is a process which helps to shape who they are in the world.
Yes.
By giving them a fuller realization of who I am, and my helping them to develop their capacity and their innate human potential. So this isn't just about the thing that we're putting together, but it's the process of socialization, which this activity entails, right? And we have a lot of experiences like that, you know. So if you think anybody, especially any brother, you know, that works with youth, you know, whether that's as a coach or as an educator, a lot of times people who work in contexts like that, I mean, it's work in the sense that it's difficult and it takes time, but there's something else that's happening there besides the toil and the drudgery. There's something else, right?
Yes.
As an educator, you know, and I'm primarily teach adults, but I also teach, you know, young people from time to time. It's not work like it's work, but it's not toil and drudgery. It's work which is focused around the fullest realization of their human potential. I don't, you know, to me, I see that as my obligation to the future. I see I'm supposed to do, why I'm here on earth. Like, why would I be here on earth if not to do this? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But let's put this in the context of the ancestral. What is work? And I really appreciate that you said what you said, because one way we could think about this is the guilds that existed in many of our ancestral societies. You have merchant guilds, you have blacksmiths guilds, you have carpenter guilds, you have societies where people were engaged in animal husbandry and hunting and the like. What did work signify in those contexts? Well, if we look at this purely on the level of the material, purely on the level of what is happening at the surface, we have a group of people who are collectively engaged in a particular social activity which is vital for the survival of the community, right? And I would argue that within the European imagination, that's really where it ends. What's happening below the surface? Below the surface, you have people engaged in processes of socialization, both socialization which is intra as well as intergenerational, right? Where people are learning not just the craft itself, but the ethics, the values, the norms, right? That encapsulate that practice.
Right.
What else is happening? You have the reinforcement of the synergistic link between one's effort, actions, and initiatives and the survival of one's people. Not just, oh, I'm giving them this food so they can eat. No, my action is a fundamental bulwark upon which the community rests.
Right.
So when we talk about this idea of spirit, again, if we consider spirit energy, this is how I participate and contribute to that vitality, that spirit, that energy which enables us to be, which enables us to exist. What's happening on a deeper level than that? Well, in many of these societies, people were concerned about the maintenance of tradition. Right. And so also in many of these societies, occupations were hereditary. And so if I'm a hunter, quite likely my father was a hunter, quite likely my grandfather and great-grandfather was a hunter. Therefore, we are also engaged in this process of the transmission of ancestral knowledge.
Yes.
And why does that matter? Because we cannot understand who we are as a people within the confining framework of present understandings and present knowledge, right? Any people, in order to fully understand themselves, have to understand themselves within the breadth of their history. to its most profound degrees possible. And
Hmm.
so these notions of the past, the notions of how this particular knowledge and these processes and those ethics have been transmitted intergenerationally gives me a deeper understanding of who I am, the import and the significance of this craft itself, and also the sacredness of that craft. Why?
Yes.
Because this is something which upholds the deeds and the value and the logic and the principles and the value of the ancestors and also contributes towards the vitality of the community. Hence, this is a sacred act. It ain't just work.
Right.
It ain't just
Right.
work. And
Right.
and and these folks don't get that. Elon Musk can't understand that.
No.
Can't
No.
understand that.
No.
You
No.
know.
Wow. Wow. I think that's a perfect way to end off. That was extremely profound. And I'm glad because that was off the cuff, just in regular conversation. But I'm glad we went there, man, because I think that gives the listeners something else to think about. Because even Marx talked about this alienation, and
Hmm.
but he
Yeah.
talked about it. We are alienated from what we produce, right?
Yeah. Right.
Um, and so our relationship to labor is in this country is totally different than
That's
what
right.
our relationship to labor
That's right.
was, before we came over here. And
That's right.
I think I think I'm about to I'm about to find some books on this subject and put it in my cart, man, because I feel like that's like, whether it's something on, just like, blacksmithing guilds in West Africa or anything,
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
I think it's important just to kind of dive into that and tap into that spirit as well.
It is. And the last thing I'll say about that, like Dr.
Hmm.
Edward Poe in his book, Combat Arts in Northern Nigeria, he talks about how, like, for instance, among the Hausa, it was the blacksmiths were the boxers. So down
Mm.
in boxing,
Hmm.
it was the purview of the blacksmith guild. And so there
Wow.
was a whole society, man. There
Wow.
was spiritual, I mean, there was a whole world in which
Right.
this existed. It wasn't just, I'm gonna go to work from 9 to 5. No, it was a whole world of rights and processes of socialization and rituals and ethics and values and norms bound up in this thing. And so it wasn't just the work. And
Mm.
the only, I think the closest that we come to realizing that in this context was when we are engaged in things which we see, um, when we're engaged in things that we see as being reflective of our agency, not just our individual
Yes.
agency, our collective agency.
Yes.
It's hard to achieve. And so
Hmm.
many of us may not have experienced that.
Hmm.
But a lot of those things, whether it's again, if you like coaching youth, you probably have felt that. If you got a garden, you have a community garden that you
Hmm.
work on to maintain with the community, you have probably experienced that. If you went on and helped your grandmother in her garden,
Right.
right? And you loved your
Mhm.
grandmother, you probably experienced it. So we experience it, but we don't get to live in that because we live under this oppression.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, everybody, I want y'all to grab this book, Jacob Carruthers and the Restoration of an African Worldview. Do you have a preference on where they get it from? I'll make sure I have the link in the description, but if you
No,
have,
but they can they can get it from the publisher. They can get off of Amazon. I can in fact I can try to send you a discount code
okay.
that you can post with it, and that way they can buy it from the publisher and get a little discount, so they can keep a little money in their pocket.
For sure. It's an amazing book, y'all. We actually did another show on some more things within the book. If y'all want to definitely go through the archives and check out. Well, again, Dr. Rashid, it's always a pleasure building with you, brother.
For sure, brother. Very good talking to you as well. Very honored to be on here, to continue the conversation, and much appreciation of your work, to bring light and enlightenment to our people. So asante sana.
Oh, thank you, and likewise, brother. What you do, again, intellect. I think a lot of people don't realize that the work starts in the mind,
That's
right?
right.
And so the what you do intellectually, from your work with ASCAC, university, to the writing, to the essays. Hey, we appreciate you, and we can't thank you enough.
Appreciate it, brother. Definitely appreciate it.
Indeed.